we're going to give a little review, and then we're going to jump into some really hard material. In fact, my wife was, when I told her what I was going to be teaching, she's like, man, I love you, and I hate it when you talk about that sort of stuff. Like, they're going to fall asleep. But ahead of time, I want to justify it, because I think that this class is going to be probably one of the more important classes, not just Jewishly you'll have, but is important in the sense of making sense of the world you live in, because we're going to be tackling what science is, the philosophy of science in particular, and what we're going to come out of this is answering the initial question we had in class 1 of the Rambam the Rambam justifying him in light of the Abarbanel, who just said, listen, the Rambam is just, he's a fad chaser. All the philosophers were making organizational lists during his time period, and that's all the 13 principles are, said the Abarbanel. The Rambam clearly would not go along with that criticism. He clearly meant what he said. And I think that to answer that Abarbanel, really we have to address a concept of science to be able to move forward and understand the Rambam. But like I said, it has it'll save you a lot of heartache in life, kind of having a grasp of these principles. So, nice. So that's what we're going to do. Right. So in last week's class, what we did was we reorganized the 13 principles of faith into 3 basic categories. One was, what is God? What does he want from us? And an idea of judgment, how what we do has value. We then explored these 7 factors that make up the concept of love, pushing forward the theory that I'm presenting to you guys, that God created the world in order for us to learn how to love. And that taking these pieces, the 13 principles of faith, a highly complex concept of love, what makes Judaism unique from all other religions is, how you set the dials to all those different factors. And what comes out is, Judaism, the way that those dials are set up, is what gives Judaism its eternal nature, which gives it its character, and ultimately makes it one of the most unique religions that exists, because it's a religion that, the way I put it is that it doesn't cannibalize itself, that people can have different theological positions, legitimately so, and while there will be disagreement, we don't end up killing each other. We don't end up, throwing a fatwa on somebody. That was last week's class. Kind of pushing this idea a little further, about this idea of struggle within religion. You can learn a lot about religion by what it calls itself. Catholicism, it means universalism, basically. To be Catholic means all-encompassing. That's what they think about themselves. It's their way or the highway. Islam means submission to, in a very large part, bury one's individuality vis-a-vis God. Buddhism means awakening. So you learn a lot from religion. So what do you learn about Israel? Am Yisrael. In Bereshis, Yaakov gets a new name. There's a lot of new name action that goes on in the Chumash. And those things are highly symbolic. It's always worthwhile to stop on those. Even just all the names in general, like breaking down the symbolism of the name Avraham or Rivka, you'll gain a lot in terms of the meaning of the text if you do that. But Yisrael is a combination of 2 different words, which roughly translates into he who will strive with God. He who will struggle with God. So what's cool is, number 1, it's in the future tense. That struggle never ceases. And it's a struggle. It's a constant battle in the world of paradox, of things that don't make sense, highly complex ideas. And at the end of the day, it's more about the struggle you put in than the conclusions that you reach. Very much in line with where we ended last week of, well, that's why we don't kill each other over theology. Because it's not about the conclusion, although conclusions are important. But it's more about the struggle and how we reach them that is the defining characteristic of Judaism. What's going to strike everybody as we go through these 13 principles of the faith is how non-negotiable they are. And the Rambam goes so far as to say, well, these are the halachic benchmarks that make you Jewish in halacha, that if you abide by justifies a claim that you're Jewish. I don't mean from a spiritual standpoint. I mean you're spiritually Jewish because of who your mom is. But in terms of being a part of the greater community. That's pretty categorical. That's pretty black and white. Worse yet is that he says that your olam haba hinges on your belief in these. So for the Rambam, these are really not negotiable concepts. But I wanted to stop, especially in looking at the name of Am Yisrael, and just kind of note, reserve judgment until the end, to our last course, because these 13 principles are indeed a struggle amongst all rabbinic authorities. Nothing is clear-cut. And even for the Rambam himself, as we dive deeper, he might, on paper, seem pretty black and white, but he has some flexibility also. So I guess I kind of want to give that, disclaimer. Don't think you're a heretic just yet if things don't match up with your own personal beliefs. Fair enough? Okay. Yeah, right, yeah. Okay. So for Barbanel, he says every single one of the mitzvahs is a principle of faith. To not buy into them would more or less cast you out. He's more non-negotiable than the Rambam. And he kind of looked at the Rambam and his organization of these 13 principles as just being kind of like an idiot's guide to Judaism. Where, if you don't have time to learn, these are the most important things you should know about, and that's what identifies you as being Jewish. As I mentioned already, really doesn't seem like the Rambam at all. Just as, as much emphasis he put in, how much hinges on these principles, no way. And the other criticism that Barbanel had is, he's just kind of being one of those philosophers. This criticism has some weight. But I think that Barbanel, he underestimated what was going on in his lifetime. Because really in this time period, in the 1200s onward, is really the birth of science. This is a complete transformation of how people experience the world. And it really began in this time period. The Rambam wasn't just organizing these things for educational sake. He was anticipating this change. He was seeing this change in front of his eyes and was trying to translate the experience of Emunah into a language people would be able to understand. So it's almost like Emunah is dying during this time period as a phenomenological experience, moving to principles to prove or disprove. It's a very different experience of the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to go a little backwards today, giving an outline of what we're going to try and cover. We're going to first define what science is today. We're going to backtrack and kind of hit the key moments in the scientific evolution within history, from the Rambam to modern times. We're going to define what Emunah was before the scientific revolution and how we define it today. And with all that information, we're going to be able to have a clear justification why the Rambam did what he did, and how and why, how important these 13 principles really are, why he bothered to make them in the first place. So we got a major nerd alert. A book none of you have ever heard of, but which is probably one of the more important books in the philosophy of science. is written by a man named Stephen Pepper in 1942. And it was called World Hypotheses, a Study in Evidence. And what he sets out to do is to demonstrate, there's this misconception of science, that science is a perfect reflection of the world. It's a description of reality. And what Stephen Pepper went and showed is, hold on, wait a second. There's a whole bunch of assumptions that are not provable, that are definitely up for dispute, that you have to have before you start the scientific endeavor. And there's specifically 4 of them that he outlines. So before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to tackle a little bit what is science trying to answer? And then we'll be able to relate more easily how these 4 are doing that. So first is something called the ontological question. What is reality? That's question number 1 the science tries to solve. And question number 2 is the epistemological question of what can man know? What are we able to know? We're limited creatures. What are we able to sort out? And in answering these 2 questions, there's basically 2 major philosophical camps. One's called positivism, and what their basic philosophy of science is that reality is something concrete and definable. It's independent of the observer. You have nothing to do with defining reality. Reality is what it is, whether you're alive or not. If a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? People who believe in positivism would say, of course it does. Okay. The other side is constructivism. And they're more or less the exact opposite of these guys. They say there's no such thing as reality outside of you. Reality is a shared experience between you and what's outside of you. You can never pull the observer out of reality. There's no such thing as a real reality. Reality, so to speak, is a relationship. That's this position. So these 4 philosophies of science that Stephen Pepper outlined, 2 of them fall into positivism, 2 fall into constructivism. What makes him cool is that his book's a hard read, but he's able to simplify these ideas really well because he uses metaphors to describe these 4 ways of looking at the world. What's kind of interesting about people, just kind of a little bit knowing about your own biology, the way you relate to the world, your body relates to the outside world in 3 different ways. Everything is either a tool, or an obstacle, or irrelevant. There's nothing else. And so what's nice about Stephen Pepper is he really he taps into this observation, and he makes these philosophies a tool. He's using metaphors to make them more tool-like so you can use them better in your daily life. So the 4 philosophies are mechanism, formism, organicism, and contextualism. And we're going to define all 4. The root metaphor of mechanism is that the world is a machine. They look at things as having everything as parts, and parts are more important than the whole. Parts make up the whole, and you can pull them apart, you can put them together, but you never change the identity of parts. That's their assumption. That's the unprovable part of mechanism. The truth criteria, what they would define as truth, is this idea of correspondence. If you can describe or make a copy of reality, right on. So like an example of this, if we kind of look at neurobiology, So mechanists would be describing the brain in very computer-like terms. Computers have parts, brains have parts, and each part is, you can pull apart a computer, you can pull apart a brain, and that's how they look at their research. And they kind of think of, even though it's a bad copy, this idea of a computer as being a copy of the brain, they say, well, the reason why they use that as a metaphor for the brain is, well, that's a copy of the brain. That's the best that they can do in describing what a brain is. It's like a computer. And the one interesting thing about mechanism is they always assume a force is at play. There's something moving the lever. If this is a machine, you have to press a button. There's always a force. So they'll use language like there's cognitive processes. When you actually go through the research, it's like, well, what are those processes exactly? Yeah, they're processes. It's this magic force that is operating the machine. This is the classic understanding of what science is to most people. This this philosophy of science has had a pretty good track record, from the 1500s on. What's cool is you guys are living in an era, we're all living in an era, that contextualism is becoming the new philosophy of science. So we'll kind of compare those two, more in depth, just because it's more applicable in how you guys are looking at your lives. So that's mechanism. Formism. The root metaphor with formism is similarity. They almost look at truth as being like I don't know if you guys have read Plato. Plato was a formist, where he had this idea of, every concept or thought or thing in the world had a pristine, perfect form, a perfect version of it somewhere in the ether. And that, the objects that were similar to those forms in the ether, well, those are approximations. Those are similar to truth. So it's kind of funny way of putting it, but there's the perfect idea of table, and all tables in our lives, well, they're not perfect. They are approximation of this perfect table concept. That's the truth claim of formism. Again, wanting this correspondence. So they're very much like mechanists. They're almost like lazy mechanists. That's a good way of thinking about formists. One difference between the two is they don't assume a force exists. There's no one moving levers because there's no machines being operated. That's just not their metaphor. Organicism, their root metaphor is organic development. How a tree goes from a seed to a little sapling to a tree and then drops seeds down and the whole cycle of life continues. That's their metaphor for truth. Their assumption is that change is inevitable. And what we really have to, the thing we should really be bothered about in life is stability. If something stays the same, well, that's what you have to prove. Well, that's weird. Why is something not changing? From their metaphor, things have to grow. You never have to justify that. Whereas for a mechanist and a formist, that thought doesn't even enter into their minds. Of course, things change. You put the parts together, you separate parts. The point I'm trying to make here is that when you're speaking from these four different philosophies, you can't speak to someone else who has a different philosophy of science than you. They have too many fundamental differences in how they look at the world to carry on a conversation where there's common ground. And their truth criteria, what makes something true is they kind of look at, there's this idea of coherence where something's true if 1,000 different pieces of information point at it, and it looks like, okay, well, if it quacks like a duck, if it waddles like a duck, if it smells like a duck, well, man, it must be a duck. That's how they define truth. And they think about contradiction as, well, you're just missing parts. If you were to know the whole of the object, Well, it would just make a whole lot of sense to you. So they value the whole, and they don't believe in parts. Again, a fundamental difference between the first two. Parts are meaningless to someone from this philosophical background. The final philosophy of science is contextualism. And this is the one that's gaining a lot of traction today. Their root metaphor is act in motion. These guys are very much getting back to the first two ideas in science of positivism and constructivism. These guys are constructivists. Like, there is no such thing as a set reality to them. Everything is based on one's perspective. You can't take out the observer from reality. They both make reality. They're not ever independent. So when a tree falls in the forest, it doesn't make a sound, according to these guys. It's a silly question to ask, according from this philosophical perspective. Their basic assumption is that the world is usable, because their criteria of truth, what makes something truthful according to these guys, is does it work? That's it. Is it workable? Does it have a function? What's really cool about this last group is because they're so worried about workability, they have a lot of flexibility to set their own terms of what they care about. Meaning, in all these other philosophies of science, we don't care about value. Emotional, motivational value might be explained by these models, but doesn't take it into account. It's not something that's important enough to put on the table. Whereas from a contextualistic standpoint, well, if workability means a workable life, well, you have to take that into account. So in many ways, Judaism is very much coming from a contextualistic philosophy of science. Workability. Does this dog hunt? And also very much reflects this idea of relationship, that the world is created based on the relationship of man and God. It's not just that God created the world and he's the only one in charge, although he is the only one in charge, but that because we have Tzelem Elohim, we're able to be co-creators with God. We create reality with God. That's very much contextualistic in the way it looks at the world. That's the most nerdy we're going to get today, so I apologize. Any questions before we move on? Because I realize I threw a lot of stuff that sounds boring and has nothing to do with anything. Any questions before we push on? Anything that wasn't clear? Okay. So like I said, the Rambam, he existed at this cusp between non-science and science. Even getting more recent, like there was no such thing. Like if you were going to university, say in the 1800s, there was no degree in science. You were getting a philosophy of nature degree. Everything was rooted in philosophy. So even science itself as a discipline is relatively new in the way that we look at the world. But he was standing at that cusp of this fundamental shift in how we look at the world around us. It's kind of interesting, especially, what's kind of interesting is the only reason why we have any philosophical writings at all, say about Aristotle, Plato, all the boys, is because of the Jews. The Christians, when they rolled into town, they did a really good job of destroying all the original text in Greek. There is no Greek version of Aristotle. Doesn't exist. So what basically happened is, well, the Muslims got a hold. They more or less, they were trying to save the original texts that were, well, they weren't even written in Greek. They went from Greek to Syriac, and then the Muslims got a hold of it and they translated it into Arabic. But then what happened is, like, people like Ibn Ezra, Jewish Rishonim, they had to have a day job because teaching Torah doesn't do so hot. So they were translators. And so they're running around in Spain, and they kind of entered into the rest of Europe. They're running around all over Europe, translating the Arabic versions of all these philosophers from Arabic to Hebrew and Latin. I want to swing back to this point, the role of Judaism and belief in God in the development of religion. In the development of science. Put that in your pockets for the end. So the birth of modern science kind of looks something like this. In 1543, we have Copernicus, who reorients everybody's view of the universe, that the sun is in the middle of our solar system, the planets are circling it. A dramatic shift in how man looks at the universe. No longer is man physically the center of the universe. The sun is. And then from there on, it was like, man, well, there's a whole bunch of galaxies. Like, we're not even the center of nothing. There's actually no such thing as center in the universe. It's like not even a question you can answer. Science develops into 1620. That's when you get the scientific method. Before then, no one did research, which, like, you look in a lot of Rishonim, like the Rivaz, an example, like, they have a lot of nasty things to say about natural scientists, and they were justified because they were horrible scientists. They didn't have the same rigorous rules to follow that exist today. Well, we go a little farther in 1687. We have Isaac Newton come on the scene, and he's able to give us physics. We can now describe mathematically motion. And like I mentioned, the late 1800s, the early 1900s is actually now science becomes a degree you can get at university. We have this development of science as a new way of looking at the world, and finally in the mid 1950s, now definitely in the 2000s, we're no longer mechanists. It's not like there's levers to push and pieces to put together, but the way that we look at science is concepts like the theory of relativity of Einstein. That's contextualistic. One's experience of the universe is largely determined where you're standing. Quantum mechanics is another monkey wrench that's thrown into how science is looked at. So we have all these new theories that are coming out that just dramatically change how we look at the world. And what this does now is reopens a door to wisdom and theology, religion, into science again. Because as I mentioned before, with all four of those different philosophies of science, the only one that has any room to deal with questions of meaning and value are the contextualists. Workability of life. You need to sort out your thought. You need to sort out your feelings. You need to sort out what your beliefs are. That matters all of a sudden in science, when it didn't originally in these other forms. So why am I telling you all this? Number one is I want to demystify what science is. Because generally speaking, people, like I said, people think of science as truth. But it ain't. The thing that, the idea of truth in science is the thing which isn't provable. That's the assumption. It's not what it does. All science does is describes the world around us, and is again grappling with this question of how important are parts as opposed to the whole? How important are we vis-a-vis what we're experiencing? That's up for grabs. It's almost become in modern times that every culture needs to have its religious leader. Primitive peoples, it was the shaman. In religious communities, it's the rabbi. Well, in modern times, it's the scientist. Well, it's like it's really, really important to know what their limitations are, because they can sell you a bag of goods and quick. Number two is in later lectures, I want when we hit the first principle about the existence of God and what that principle entails, we're going to have to tackle the atheists. And these guys, they are mechanists like you wouldn't believe. They don't even entertain the idea that there's a philosophy of science. So it's already, we're with conversations with the new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, they it's not that they're not being truthful, but they really aren't telling you the whole story. They're mechanists, and it's not so simple that their assumptions are truthful to begin with. So take it with a grain of salt. But for our purposes here today, this lead-up is the evolution of science that the Rambam was at the beginning of. And when you relate to the world in this more scientific way, Emunah changes because we're changing. The way that we look at the world changes us fundamentally. It used to be that almost like the Chazal science, what was their philosophy of science? It was very, very phenomenological. What mattered most was the person's experience, their lived experience of what was going on in front of them. And this has huge implications in halacha. I just want to throw out a couple, because without this knowledge, these things sound silly. We have a principle in halacha, a Mishnah in Kilayim, that halacha is determined lefi daito shel roeh, according to what the person sees. So how do you define day in halacha? It's when the sun sets. Okay, simple enough. Well, doesn't the sun set the same way everywhere? Well, not if there's a mountain. Kind of imagine, two mountains here and we have a valley here. Well, day is going to end much later in the city on top of this mountain than the city on this mountain. This city is going to, Shabbos is going to come in hours before this city will. So how is it that literally a 30-minute walk, let's say, Shabbos has already been going on for 4 hours? I'm giving extreme examples, but how do you explain that if it isn't this idea of what one sees is the predominant, is the criteria of truth for Judaism? Not entirely, but is a major one. Another example that comes up, drinking water. We're not allowed to eat bugs, right? So you pour water from the tap, get a microscope, I look at this guy under the microscope. What do I see? I see loads of bugs. This thing is infested. They're just microscopic. Can I drink it? Well, according to Rabbi Yonasan Bender, the modern poskim of today, he says, if I were to take a microscope and look at this water, I've perceived the bugs. It's now forbidden for me to drink this bottle of water now that I've seen those bugs. But if I were to go to that same tap, pour a new glass of water, permitted. Now, it's certainly true from a mechanistic perspective that there are bugs there. It doesn't matter, says halacha. Even something as serious as someone eating a kazayas, an olive's worth of pig, that's punishable, and it's not so nice to get slugged up by the courts. What's that determined by? The witnesses that saw you do it, whatever they experienced as a kazayas, whatever they think an olive is, that determines whether or not you're going to be punished or not. What we see, what we experience, is what's most important in Judaism. What was going on for the Rambam in redefining Emunah makes I think it's easier to see with, on Pesach, everyone pulls out all these booklets of all the different shirim. We have Rav Moshe's shir of a kazayas. We have the Chazon Ish's shir, and they all have this, this one is, this amount of you have to eat, and that amount you have to eat. And they're always very specific numbers. Well, what I'm telling you, that's not really how the halacha is decided. It's what your experience, what you feel a kazayas is. But even in halacha, what occurred because of this fundamental shift in how we look at science and how we look at what truth is, poskim literally had to redefine Well, okay, fine. We have to redefine what your experience is. You experience a measuring stick. You experience clocks. You're very precise in your measurements. So they had to come out a lafi halacha with precise measurements. Not because that's the original concept. No, there was a change in reality, and halacha had to conform to that change. And that's exactly what was going on with the Rambam. If we were to take a step back and try and define what Emunah pre-science is, I think the Chazon Ish has a pretty good definition in his book, Emunah B'Tachon, where he defines Emunah as this human characteristic of being curious. That's what Emunah is. That we have this tantalizing sort of like need to explore the world. And what makes that Emunah, the reason why we're curious is because, well, we just inherently assume there's meaning there. Well, why else are you curious? If the thing doesn't have meaning, why do you care? Because there's something in us on a natural level, on a very basic level, that just pushes us to assume everything has meaning. So all Emunah is a behavior of being curious. And within a religious context, well, what Emunah becomes is we're pretty curious about God. We assume there's meaning in the world in a more general sense. That's what Emunah is, just being open and curious and playful, and hey, that's interesting, there's God. That must have meaning, why not? So when people were changing the way that they experienced the world, that sense, that experience of curiosity on a religious level and how we are with God was changing too. And it went from God as an experience we have to something that has to be proven. It's a preposition. In Greek, they call it a pistis. It's a preposition. That's in all the Greek translations of these sorts of religious works. They're not talking about Emunah in that sort of way. They're talking about as though God's on trial. And if we prove God's existence, he gets to live. And if we disprove existence, well, that's a capital crime. And it's punishable by death. God doesn't exist. But that's what science has done in the way that we relate to the world. Things are provable or not provable. Zehu. So we've lost a lot in how powerful or how much value we put into our living experience. I mean, in the work that I do as a therapist, this is one of the biggest problems people have in life, is they just don't trust themselves. People will come in with all sorts of very, very specific rules of what it means to be a good person, to be a good wife, to be a good employee. And it's like the more rules you pop on there, the more premises you have that you've proven to yourself somehow. These rules deny you the experience of, doesn't look like that rule's working out. That rule of how you're supposed to be a mom and be such a disciplinarian. Well, I mean, it's a value, true, to discipline your kids, but you're terrorizing them. Don't do that. And it's a struggle because they don't sense they're being a terror to their children. They think they're being a good parent. That's the rule they have. And so the work that I do, as a therapist, is to try and sidestep proving and disproving a person's ideas and just, brass tacks. Like, let's get real here. Is that your experience? When you discipline your kids this way, just think for a moment. Let's go back a couple months, a couple years. Is this going down in the dirt, or is this actually working out? And it's always surprising to me that when I ask that question, how often these rules, which people really, really held to rigidly, all of a sudden evaporate rather quickly. Like, that's how disconnected we are to our experiences. Even when our life is complete chaos and the worst nightmare you could ever have is actually in front of you. No. This is a rule. I'll keep going. That's how little we trust our experience. And so my hunch is, this idea in Judaism about how previous generations were greater. My hunch is it's very much on this point. That this greatness is not so much like they were big, huge giants. Like, it's not that, but more, that they actually trusted their experience more. They were more in touch with They were more in touch with their bones and their skin. What they felt actually mattered. They didn't have to prove everything all the time. This is another problem just in general about the more of an individual you are, the more you separate yourself from a community, the more you have to prove yourself. So there's a cultural component to this. You see this in the way that people argue in Israel as opposed to the States. If you're having an argument with someone, you got bad service, let's say, you basically have to prove that you were screwed over, right? Like that's more or less what you're doing. You have rights. These are the specific examples of how your rights were trampled on, and that wasn't fair. And that's very much this sort of, you have to prove things, there are rules, there's a way of being, and as an individual, you constantly have to prove you have a right to exist. There isn't the assumption you exist. In the same way as in collectivist societies, when you're in a group, it's automatically assumed you exist. It's automatically assumed you're important. People don't argue that way in Israel. This is to make your lives a little easier in this country. If you want to make a good argument, you make arguments based on friendship and mercy. I was having a hard time. People are people. You wanna. I'm not trying to say that you should be manipulative, but like this is how. Kind of sounds like you should be manipulative, but like this is the heart of how different cultures can very much be. Is how you argue your right to exist. This is how deep this way of how you experience the world can get. Well, but if you just trust your experiences, you don't have to justify that you exist. It becomes a conversation of friendship. It becomes a conversation of, oh man, the kids were crying, I'm sorry I was giving you a hard time. Can you cut me some slack? The answer will be, of course, every time. So what the Rambam did, almost like a desperate attempt to save Emunah, was he did what any good scientist does. He operationalized it. He broke it down into pieces and said basically, okay, look, you have these pieces, that equals Emunah. Every research project, your concepts are operationalized. It's something like, if you take a personality test, let's say, so it'll be measuring, are you an extrovert? Are you open to experience? Are you neurotic? Are you threat sensitive? And well, how do you define those things? So you have to operationalize these concepts. You basically scour the entirety of human literature anytime almost like you're grouping verbs, you're grouping adjectives together, and you're trying to find a common denominator to them. Being an extrovert is, you like talking with people, that's an extrovert. You like going to parties, you get energy when you talk to people, and those are the qualities that make up being an extrovert. And you can run your research and discover cool stuff. Well, that's exactly what the Rambam did. He just operationalized Emunah into these 13 principles of faith. But it wasn't because he had a bright idea, or it wasn't because he was making some revolutionary discovery. For thousands of years, Judaism did really pretty good without these 13 principles. Thousands of years, we didn't have to describe what Judaism is. We all just knew it. Well, it's because we knew it in our bones. It's a type of I don't want to say de-evolution, but for lack of a better term, it was almost a de-evolution of religion. The Rambam had to step in and save Judaism with these 13 principles, just so that you could relate to it better. I want to swing back. I mentioned to you to put in your pockets. It was important to remember, who gave science to the world. The Jews, people like Ibn Ezra. Why was that important? Because I talked a lot about meta philosophies in science, but there's a meta philosophy that doesn't matter. All of these 4 philosophies have to buy into. They all buy into the idea there is a truth. They all buy into the idea there is an order. And they all buy into the fact that man can notice it. Man is special enough that we can understand it. Every single one of those are a religious idea. It was the Jews that put that into science. It's those ideas that make science work. I don't think that the scientific enterprise would have gotten off the ground if those three ideas weren't at the heart, at the very beginning, when the Greek philosophical works were were spilling into Europe. A thought. That more or less does it for me today. Any questions? What we went through, or I kind of feel bad. I feel a little guilty because it was kind of dry, but did we get through it more or less? Yeah. Okay. All right, take it easy, guys.